I'd like to welcome Toni Hassan, who is our guest speaker for the Christians for Ethical Society via Zoom under these special conditions. Toni, lovely to have you with us. The topic that you're going to speak to and we're going to have a conversation about is screen addiction and the next generation. Before we have a conversation, I'd just like to introduce you, Toni, to the people that will be watching. Toni Hassan is an Associate Fellow with the Centre for Responsible Technology at the Australian Institute and an Adjunct Research Fellow at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture of Charles Sturt University, and a frequent writer on many things in the Canberra Times and elsewhere. And it's been my pleasure to know Toni over many years, and really delighted, Toni, to be able to speak to you about a topic close to your heart. You grappled with the questions concerning screen addiction and the next generation in a recent book called Families in the Digital Age, Every Parent's Guide in 2019, a wonderful book. Toni, welcome.
Thank you.
Perhaps to begin, when you wrote your book, did you have any idea how relevant it might be 6 months into COVID-19 and the question?
Stephen, I had thought I might have been exaggerating this problem, but the last 6 months have certainly highlighted some of those deep concerns that you and I and others now share. Because for those of us who've tried to create some boundaries around the digital, well, the floodgates have opened. And of course, the pandemic has been cover really for every child across Australia and in many parts of the world to have to be on a digital platform provided by a contractor, a private operator, a commercial force. So kids are having to log on, or have had to log on at 9 a.m. and engage the screen. And you and I may be overwhelmed on a Monday morning by the numbers of emails in our inbox. But imagine if you're an emerging little person who really doesn't understand that system and is being asked to, one, log on, make sense of written material, work through folders and decide what task to start with and to get through her morning with a semblance of order. I think it's just asked too much of kids. It's been overwhelming and there've been tears at our place, I tell you. And I guess the real concern is about engagement, you know, beyond the mental or cognitive overload I think children have had at this time. It's been real to me that if a child is intrinsically motivated, the digital can enhance the learning outcomes, enhance the learning journey. But if they're already unmotivated, it makes things worse because we're social learners. We learn in situ. And without the nudging of peers and the instruction of a teacher in real space and time, why go there? So absenteeism has been a real issue. Studies emerging out of the United States show 1 in 2 children have been logging on.
Thank you, Toni. The digital world and the screen addiction and the things that you're talking about suggest to me not only an overload of the digital world and its oppressiveness. To that extent, what might you say about this as a public health issue?
Absolutely. I've increasingly seen it as a public health issue, especially in the last year working for the Australian Public Health Association, the peak public health body, seeing the parallels increasingly with another problem, not just in Australia, and that is rising obesity rates. So let's unpack obesity for a minute and then compare. So too often we might know somebody who has a high BMI index, body mass index, and we might assume, look, they're just not exercising enough. They're eating too much. They're just not disciplined. In fact, there's probably a temptation to say the person's just been, frankly, a bit too lazy, when in fact there's a whole lot of factors at play, and it's ultimately to do with the environment. So we're creating an obesogenic environment. One, most of us go to work and sit in front of a screen all day. So compared to just some decades ago, we've taken exercise out of our routine. 2, we're just exposed to high dense or calorie foods 24/7. You know, we're tempted to go there It's been normalized. And so we've got an obesogenic environment, Stephen, and you have to say, well, it's not about the individual anymore. It's not about the family anymore. It's about the environment. And for the digital, we've created a hyper digital environment that's normalized going there all the time. And we're doing it involuntarily. That's, I think, the real concern is we're not just addicted. The machines are designed to be addictive. And so we're going there, you know, classic conditioning, you know, in education, we talk about classic conditioning and which is involuntary. So you present a child with a snack they like and they begin to salivate. They're not even thinking consciously about that. And we think of voluntary or intentional conditioning, you know, with obvious reward that's hopefully intrinsic. What's happening is kids are going there without thinking. It's so habitual now.
Well, that's an interesting point about going there without thinking. I can imagine somebody might come back to you and say, well, sure, these are problems, but human beings are remarkably creative. They can adapt. We're an adaptive species. Can't we find some really creative ways of adapting to overcome some of the dangers of this, the public health aspect of this? Or are we just on a road down to cybernetics and robotic worlds where we don't actually critically engage with anything? We just are voyeurs of the digital world, and we just drink heavily from the well and there's no hope for us. Or can we adapt?
Well, we are an adaptive species for sure. I mean, if we were to go right back, we moved from being hunter-gatherers to agrarian, not because actually it was good for us. It made us sedentary. We were active in ways that we were not active now, but we became more sedentary, and we became hoarders. You know, we became conscious of property, and then that's when the fences went up, right? And it just became what we did. It wasn't because it was inherently good for us. So there's lots of examples through time of us normalizing behavior and really finding it too hard to change because that's all we know. And as for that public health parallel, obesity, well, we are seeing it as a public health issue, a critical issue, an emergency of sorts, with intervention, prevention, and then at the other end, clinical care for people who really need it. And I'm beginning to think that that's where we have to go. We have to think in terms of intervention, prevention, and clinical care for those who need it. So, you know, we've got recommendations at the moment suggesting kids shouldn't be on screens under 2, should be on screens for 2 hours under 5, and limited screen time beyond the age of 5. Well, no one's paying any attention. And I would be more optimistic, Stephen, if I thought there were not commercial forces behind this.
Well, you've just raised that question about commercial forces. I want to come back to you on precisely that. In another conversation, you mentioned the 4 beasts in the room. And I said, what could these 4 beasts could be? And you said Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. And I had never thought of them as 4 beasts, but
yes,
they are watching us and we are being watched by these beasts. Say something about those and the power of these beasts.
I'd add Microsoft too, actually. So 4 or 5 beasts minimum. The monsters in the room aren't there because they worry for your soul, Stephen.
No.
Or they worry about the health and well-being of my 10-year-old. They're profit-making. And while there was an energy and excitement about the possibilities of the egalitarian internet that would bring information into people's homes, that would create enormous access and have great potential for participatory democracy, the reality is they've got too big, and governments have been allowed to be out of the way for too long. Now they're scrambling to control them, appreciating the impacts on democracy, appreciating the impacts on the economy, on journalism for one. So, yeah, the reality is these big tech giants that we think in using their products, get agency. We think there's the illusion of control, the illusion of choice. But it is just that, an illusion, because when we use them, they use us. And adults can understand that much, you'd hope. They may have the wherewithal to be disciplined in their use and appreciate the monsters in the room. But children and young people don't have that wherewithal. And worse, they don't have the impulse control. Their brains are not at the stage where they're able to engage it voluntarily. They engage it impulsively. And so, you know, lots of things become cues for them to go there. Not just the time of day, I've come home, I'm having a snack, go to the screen. It's situation, it's time, it's so many things. They operate out of emotion and with a social impulse. So they want to go and catch up with their friends there, but they never really catch up and they are never really satisfied. I talk about increasingly this idea, Stephen, of recognition hunger, which is why these machines work so well. They recognize human desire to be recognized. You know, the infant looks to her mother at the breast with, you know, valuable eye contact that says, I belong to you. You make the connections early, and it never really leaves us the need for that. And the designers of social media in particular, using psychology and behavioral therapy, understand why we go there, and they hook us in, and they give us likes and ticks and shares and retweets. But it's a fake recognition, and it never satisfies the hunger in us.
Well, that's extremely scary, to be honest. I mean, it makes it. I asked myself the question as you were speaking: who's in charge? I wonder whether this notion of freedom, free speech, free market is a chimera, that is actually an illusion. But we live under the illusion that we are free agents. But in fact, from what you're saying, there are some very powerful entities running the ship, so to speak.
Yes, and to bring it back to education, every jurisdiction now has signed a deal with big tech to deliver the online platform. And there's just not a lot of transparency around those arrangements. There's something around privacy, and we're told that the data isn't being mined, but data is the coal of today and tomorrow, you know, and so it's the oil. And I don't want to trust big tech. I don't think we should trust big tech. It's already using the algorithms powerfully with experiments Facebook has been public about, trying to change voter behaviour. So it is nudging us in the real world to change how we behave. And if Google, you know, has captured an infant, because infants are on these things, then it's captured you for life.
What kind of tensions does this, how does this play out in tensions in ordinary domestic family life, for example?
Well, it results in increasing conflict. So families typically experience conflict most days around screen time. But the hardest part is that parents themselves are compulsively using it. So we learn through observation. So even if you don't mimic what mum and dad do, you learn through observation, and you wish to be like them. That's what children do. So that's the power of this. It's creating tension at home. It's reducing time to be together. So it's thinning time together. I would say we are alone together, because it's pixelated families. They're going into their private spaces to be on their own machines.
Who hasn't experienced this, I must say? The notion of alone together, it brings images to my mind of experiences I've had in my own family context, where 4 of us are in the room, all on our computers, in total silence. And so it's surreal.
And because it's computer-mediated communication, privately done often, it doesn't encourage cooperation.
No.
And so the time you have together is sort of, it's even harder. So that's some of the impacts. As to impacts on children's mental health and well-being, we know they're losing sleep. We know they're losing capacity to concentrate for very long, because this is a tool for distraction, right? These are the eyeball merchants, sucking up your time. Before you know it, you've been on it a few hours. And as I say, it's habit forming. And so it's very hard to break habit, especially if everybody's doing it, it's normalised. So there's attention deficit issues for students. That's coming up. It's coming through the literature now. Kids are increasingly anxious. That'd be the thing I would stress most here. So we all need a little bit of stress, to motivate us, but we don't want that much. And so kids living with the real and deep desire, especially when you want to be and belong as an adolescent, are going to their phones or their screens to engage. But they are anticipating what is essentially an intermittent reward system at play. So 1 minute they'll go and be rewarded with, gee, you look gorgeous in that picture, share, like, kiss, retweet, whatever. But the next time they go and they'll be punished, because we are less likely to be gentle in our communication online. Without those other visual and non-verbal cues, we're just frankly more narcissistic, more rude. And so kids are confronted with a kind of comment that, on paper might not seem much, but because it's about being and belonging, it hurts. And so they fear engaging the screen because of the intermittent reward system in play, but they can't not go there because of a fear of missing out. So they're anxious on it and they're anxious off it. So it's this the science of this is really powerful. It's the dopamine hit they get, the sugar hit of I'm liked, but then that sugar being withdrawn as well.
One of the things you've mentioned in that is about concentration span. This seems to me to be a really serious issue for learning in an educational environment, that we're a highly visual culture, but our capacity to listen is becoming seriously impaired, and the kind of technology that engages us in the digital world undermines our capacity for lengthy concentration. Any comment about that?
Yes, well, the business of learning is a complex one. There's a few things going on. One, we're overconfident about what it is we can do, because there are a lot of inputs online, and we go there and we learn a lot, right? I mean, one of the real pluses is we could learn so many things, including language, other languages. So the YouTube video will tell you how something works, but it doesn't necessarily translate because it's not being lived. And it's not in situ, it's not all that stuff that the classroom hopefully offers, which is peer support and learning from others as well as the screen. So we're overconfident. There's this sort of observation now that kids are graduating thinking they know a lot, but then they're in a workplace thinking they're managerial material. They really haven't been able to integrate the vast amounts of things they're able to take on online, or in particular ways. There's an absence of modality. It's sort of, it's text or it's sometimes video, but it's not living it with your head and your heart, not embodying that information. That's the problem.
One of the scary sorry.
And of course, concentration is a problem because it thins our ability to focus for long. Yes. We multitask more often. So there's this illusion that we're incredibly productive because we're there and we're flicking between screens and we're a bowerbird for things, and we think we're integrating it, but we're actually not. And we know that multitasking isn't the best way to go, because it short circuits our ability to remember long term.
Have you wondered what kind of a human being are we producing in our culture through the digital world particularly? What will the young children be as discerning adults in 30 years' time if we continue on this track?
Well, I guess what we've already discussed suggests a child that is often projecting.
Yes.
And because of the ability to fashion a profile there from very young, there's less time generally to mature without that stimuli, to work out who you want to be, to reflect, to self-regulate emotion. That's a big one. So we were invited to give snappy, instant responses, which aren't often the best responses, and then that creates a spiral because of conflict with the receiver or whatever. So we're living with high levels of anxiety and conflict online, and it's thinned our ability to quieten the mind, to reflect, to join the dots, and to develop a coherent sense of self. I think that's a key thing, to tend to the self, because we do a lot there, and they're tasks, and then when we stop, we don't know what to do with ourselves, so we go back there. So you actually need zone out times when you're doing nothing to reinvent, or to imagine, actually, because that's what's happening. Is we think it's giving us, as we said, giving us control and choice. It creates the illusion of choice and control, but actually what it's taking away is initiative.
Yes.
So we're thinning our ability to initiate, to imagine. And because of the constant projecting, am I okay? Who loves me today? Am I okay? Who loves me today? And we repeat that again and again. And because of that, we become less empathetic, because we're focusing on the self. And therefore, obviously, with Donald Trump as the extreme, unable to put our feet in the shoes of others, and operating from a very narcissistic place.
Toni, where do we go with this? You've identified some of the fundamental dynamics which are very destructive, potentially, of human life and society. Okay, what's plan B? Is there a way to unlearn some of the unhelpful and unhealthy material and ways of modalities of engaging with this digital world? And are there some healthy ways of proceeding without saying, right, let's kill all the computers, so to speak?
Well, as with most things, whether it's calorie-dense food or our online worlds, it's about moderation, about balance. I mean, I think there are some advocacy things to do. You know, if you're minded to want to write to an MP or engage your local politician, then there are things to do, which is to ask for more accountability and transparency about how big tech engages students. Just what is the deal? What are the directorates getting out of this? And what is big tech getting out of this? We've got no long-term longitudinal studies on the impact of technology or screens in schools. Nothing. So we're operating out of a vacuum at the moment. We're all being told it's good for us. It's the future. But if kids have less analytical skills, less capacity to concentrate, you can't tell me that that's going to be good for, that we're creating safe passage for children for the complexities of adulthood. So there's that to do. And then there's the stuff to do at home. It's checking in as an adult, of course, with your own digital use. So doing a bit of a tech audit. How do I use this machine? And what am I modeling? So it becomes really hard to want to change behaviour at home if we aren't conscious of how we behave. So that's the first thing. And then it's thinking about what we can reclaim, understanding what helps us thrive, what helps us grow both meaning, purpose, connection. I invite people quite simply to reclaim conversation, You know, Stephen, when I wrote the book over sort of some years, published last year, I was really talking about the teens.
Yeah.
But now I see that actually the problem is under 5.
Yeah, absolutely.
The really little people.
Yeah.
Who are turning up to school unable to put sentences together, unable to talk. So something's going on at home where they're just not reclaiming conversations and the possibilities for reciprocal learning, for listening, for the ebb and flow of dialogue that generates understanding. Because at school, right, you remember your time, it's essentially constructivism at work. So the teacher might ask you a question, what do you know, Stephen? Then ask peers who'll pitch in with their own ideas, and then the teacher adds new information in situ and you build on that. Now, that's what's happening in conversation. And I know it's a key way that I learn about the world, through questions and through listening to others. So, and making sense of things that way. So if we're not having conversations, gosh, everything else becomes harder.
Yeah.
Certainly cooperation becomes harder.
You mentioned earlier on in the conversation about regulation, modelling and intentionality as really important community tools. I mean, what is the government responsibility in regulating the social and the digital world and its sociality? And you mentioned just now about the modelling in families about conversations and being intentional about them. Could you say something about government responsibilities for the regulation of the digital world?
Well, first and foremost, we live in a commonwealth. And inherent in that is the idea that wealth is shared. So there are first and foremost just equity issues that the digital raises. Poorer families where you're less able to fund a tutor or even have the internet on when you need it, there's going to be a digital gap, right? It's not as pronounced here as it is in the United States, but that's just something obviously governments have to be mindful of. As I say, I think the directorates or education departments have a role in being transparent about why they've engaged, you know, why we are going down this path. You know, there's not even the initial work. We've never had, I guess, a clinical trial of sorts. We haven't been able to say, well, this group of students haven't been exposed to Chromebooks, bring your own device in schools, versus this group to say, well, one has worked less or better than the other. So we're just flying blind here. Yeah. So they have an obligation, if they're going to introduce a policy, to monitor and evaluate it in the very least. Look, I think there's a conversation about big tech more generally. Governments do have a role to break up monopolies. We have a competition regulator who's saying we are worried. We think there's something to do that just pulls apart these giants, these invasive giants. So that's something of what governments can do. But I do think there's just some modelling to happen at that level. Parliaments today, honestly, MPs in the chamber, the little time they are in the chamber, are on their phones.
Yeah, yes.
They're not even listening to each other in that space. And there's some inherent problems, of course, with the way we do parliaments. They're by nature adversarial. So, you know, we come back to modelling.
Toni, this has been a fascinating conversation and I'm sure quite illuminating for many people. As you've been speaking, I remembered a book by a famous anthropologist, Mary Midgley, who wrote this book, Wisdom, Information and Wonder. What is knowledge for? And it is a scary thought that the digital world and screen addiction and the things that are related to that, they beg the question about how wisdom is formed in human beings and in human community. And it raises for me a very concerning issue about the loss of wisdom and what that does to the development of character. in a world which is driven by skills and money and achievement and what you're going to succeed in, and as if that's the measure of one's character and the wisdom of life.
Well, just to illustrate, when you talk about perseverance, building character and so on, so there is an overconfidence online, and certainly young children and young people are often better than the adults in understanding that place, navigating it relatively quickly. And that's my frustration, is that often teachers say, or principals will say, well, that's the future. No, it's not. If they're critical thinkers, they'll navigate that space quickly when it's given to them to navigate quickly, So let's give them foundational tools first before expecting them to engage online. So even handwriting, we're mark makers from way back. Even hunter-gatherers, they were making marks in those caves, and they were storytellers. And we had mythology that connected people across ages that resulted in the greatest gift of all, which is cooperation. I mean, we're a species that's been able to cooperate because of shared myth. But online, we are increasingly tribalized. So we don't even have shared myth now. The risk is we don't have shared myth. So there are some real problems in terms of generating meaningful stories that bind us together. A lot of people will tell you, I make great connections online. I meet people like me, and that's exactly right. You meet people like you. So that's a challenge. But as for wisdom is found joining the dots. So I come back to creating spaces for quietening the mind. The power of walking, of course, we've all experienced during COVID, the absence of gyms and other things. More of us are in our local parks and going up local mountains. Doing the things that don't require too much mental strain, but actually just in repetitive movement we find comforting, but allows us also to free the mind and free ourselves of those stresses and anxieties to think more clearly about the way forward. I'm all about, at the moment, re-engaging materiality, because this is a mess-free space. And, children, as I mentioned earlier, are overconfident about their ability because, Mum, I can make buildings there. I can build villages and cities. I'm in there in the Minecraft and other things, the Lego version online.
Yeah.
And then Mum says, well, let's make that thing or something of that thing in the real world. The child is used to praise about what he does there, but then falls to pieces in the real world trying to make anything like a house or a swing. Just connecting hammer to nail and putting together some timber becomes a real physical challenge, and the child has no perseverance for it. And this is what families have to unlearn the digital to re-engage the material and teach play and perseverance, because kids have forgotten or haven't ever learnt what play is.
Toni, that's a very poignant point to conclude this very interesting Zoom on screen addiction and the next generation. We have forgotten about play and materiality and the stuff of things and embodiedness. I recall a colleague of mine many years ago saying to me, Stephen, the older I get, the more I realize good things take time. And the learning required for the constructive life that we're called in human community and in society, it takes time, and it has to be tactile and embodied. The digital world might contribute to that, but it's not a substitute. And when it becomes the substitute and a sort of a second life in the digital world, then we've got a problem.
Well, you need protein.
Yeah.
The digital world gives us sugars.
That's lovely. I love that.
And Yeah, I do worry. You know, I think we're often engaging our working memory online. You know, I can remember the last sentence I just wrote because I can refer to it, and so it's a working memory. And there's no embedding. So to develop long-term memory and muscle memory for other things, that's also, yeah, what's going on. And so I invite families to think about other ways of being. Of course, being in nature, but also getting in with the clay and cooking. You know, being engaged in sensory activity that uses all of us.
Mm, mm. Thank you so much, Toni Hassan. It's been a delight to welcome you to Christians for an Ethical Society through this Zoom. And I hope, and I'm quite sure that what you've offered, when it's accessed by many people out in the digital world that we've been talking about, will provoke some very careful thinking and hopefully conversations in families and beyond. So thank you very much, Toni.
A pleasure. Thank you, Stephen.